It called his name the same way, calm and steady, but there was a subtle difference in its tone. It no longer sounded like it was trying to get his attention. It sounded like it already had it. This time, Lucas didn't respond immediately. He sat still, listening, trying to figure out where the voice was coming from. Then it spoke again, not just his name, but something more. It told him to come closer. The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they carried a strange weight that made him hesitate. Slowly, he stood up and looked toward the hallway. He was certain now that the voice was coming from there. As he moved forward, he noticed something that made him stop. The door to his spare room was slightly open. He never left it open. That alone was enough to unsettle him. Carefully, he approached, his eyes fixed on the narrow gap. Beyond it was only darkness. No light, no movement. There are certain places people pass through every day without giving them much thought. Elevators are one of them. You step in, press a button, wait a few seconds, and step out again. Simple, predictable, routine. Most of the time, nothing unusual happens. But every now and then, something small goes wrong. A delay, a flicker, a stop where there shouldn't be one. And sometimes, those small moments are not mistakes. In a high-rise apartment building in the center of the city, there was an elevator that residents quietly avoided, especially late at night. It wasn't broken, and it wasn't out of service. In fact, it worked perfectly fine during the day. But after midnight, people began to notice something strange. The elevator would occasionally stop at floors that didn't exist. The building had 20 floors. Everyone knew that. The buttons inside the elevator were clearly labeled from 1 to 20, with no missing numbers, no hidden levels. But more than a few residents had reported the same experience. They would step inside, press their floor, and somewhere along the ride, the elevator would stop unexpectedly. The doors would open slowly, revealing nothing. Not a hallway, not another floor, just darkness. At first, most people dismissed it. A lighting issue, maybe, a trick of perspective. But the stories kept repeating, always the same, always late at night, and always involving that same quiet moment when the doors opened to something that shouldn't have been there at all. One of the residents who experienced it firsthand was a man named Daniel Hayes, who had recently moved into the building for work. Daniel was practical, observant, and not easily unsettled. He didn't pay attention to rumors, especially ones that sounded as vague as elevator stories. To him, it was just another building with old wiring and occasional mechanical quirks. That belief held steady until the night he stayed out later than usual. It was well past midnight when he returned, the lobby empty and silent, except for the faint hum of overhead lights. He stepped into the elevator without thinking, pressed the button for his floor, and leaned back as the doors closed. Everything felt normal at first. The elevator moved smoothly, the numbers above the door lighting up one by one as it ascended. Then, somewhere between floors, it stopped. The sudden stillness caught his attention immediately. The display above the door flickered for a moment, but instead of showing a number, it went blank. Daniel frowned, straightening slightly as he waited for the elevator to continue. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the doors opened. At first, he thought the lights in the hallway had gone out, but as he looked closer, he realized it wasn't a hallway at all. There was no floor beyond the threshold, no walls, no visible space, just a dark, empty void that seemed to absorb the light from inside the elevator. Daniel didn't move. He stood there staring, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It didn't look like a malfunction. It didn't look like anything he had ever seen before. It looked wrong. After a few seconds, the doors closed on their own, and the elevator resumed its movement as if nothing had happened. The display flickered back to life, showing the correct floor numbers again, climbing steadily until it reached his destination. When the doors opened this time, everything was normal. A well-lit hallway, closed apartment doors. Daniel stepped out slowly, his mind still trying to process what had just happened. He turned back briefly, looking at the elevator as the doors closed again. For a moment, he considered going back down, testing it, trying to prove to himself that it had been some kind of glitch, but he didn't. Something about that empty darkness had stayed with him. The next day, Daniel asked around casually, bringing up the elevator in conversation with a neighbor. The reaction he received was immediate and quiet. The neighbor didn't laugh or dismiss the idea. Instead, he simply nodded and said that it was better not to use the elevator late at night. That was all. No explanation, no details, just a warning. Daniel didn't push further, but the unease remained. Over the next few days, he found himself thinking about it more often than he expected. The image of that empty space stayed in his mind, not fading, not changing, just waiting. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. A few nights later, just after midnight, he returned to the elevator. The lobby was silent again, just as it had been before. He stepped inside, pressed a random floor, and waited. The doors closed, and the elevator began to move. For a while, everything was normal. Then, without warning, it stopped again. The display flickered, went blank, and the doors slowly opened. The darkness was there again. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just empty, it felt deeper, as though the space beyond the elevator wasn't just absence, but something waiting to be filled. Daniel remained still, watching carefully. The light from the elevator stretched outward, but it didn't reach anything. There was no floor, no walls, no sense of distance. Then very faintly, he heard something. A sound. Not mechanical, not part of the building. A movement. From within the darkness, Daniel's breath slowed as he listened. The sound was subtle, almost too quiet to notice, but it was there. Something shifting, something approaching, though he couldn't see it. And then, just as quickly the doors closed again, the elevator moved, as if nothing had happened. From that point on, Daniel began to notice something else. The stops were becoming more frequent. Not every night, but often enough that it no longer felt random. And each time the doors opened, the darkness seemed closer. Not physically, but somehow more aware. One night, as the elevator stopped again and the doors slid open, Daniel did something he hadn't done before. He stepped forward, not fully out of the elevator, but just enough to feel the edge beneath his foot. There was something there, a surface, barely visible, but real. And as he stood there, balanced between the known and the unknown, he felt it. A presence, closer than before, as though something had been waiting just beyond the light, waiting for him to step out. He pulled back immediately, the doors closing just seconds later. The elevator continued its ascent, but the feeling didn't leave him. It followed him, lingering in the back of his mind, quiet and patient. Days later, something changed again. This time, when the elevator stopped and the doors opened, there was no darkness. There was a hallway, dimly lit, silent, but not part of the building. The walls looked unfamiliar. The layout felt wrong. And at the far end of the hallway, there was another elevator, waiting, with its doors open. Daniel stared at it, his pulse quickening. The scene felt too precise, too deliberate to be random. It looked like an invitation, or a replacement. He didn't move, and after a few seconds, the doors of his elevator closed once again. The next morning, one of the residents in the building was reported missing. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of where they had gone. Their apartment was untouched, their belongings still in place. The only detail that stood out was the last recorded camera footage in the lobby. It showed them entering the elevator just after midnight and never coming back out. Since then, fewer people use the elevator at night. Most take the stairs. Others simply avoid going out after a certain hour. But the elevator still works. It still moves. And sometimes, late at night, it still stops at floors that don't exist. And if the doors open for you, you might see darkness, you might hear something waiting, or if you stay long enough, you might see another elevator, already open, waiting for you to step inside. It's Mythic Murmurs,